The moment a Mafia boss rose from his velvet booth in the middle of Sammy Davis Jr.'s performance, every heart in that Las Vegas showroom stopped beating. The year was 1963, and the Sands Casino had never known such suffocating silence. Cigarette smoke hung frozen in the spotlight beams as Sammy's voice trailed off mid-note, his tap shoes suddenly quiet against the polished stage. The orchestra behind him became statues with instruments, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly who commanded this terrible pause. The mob boss's chair scraped against the floor like a knife dragged across stone, the sound echoing through the paralyzed room. His tailored suit caught the stage lights as he stood, every thread worth more than most men earned in a year, and his face wore the expression of a man unaccustomed to being anything less than worshipped. Around him, his associates remained seated, but their hands moved subtly beneath the table, a gesture every showgirl and dealer recognized. This wasn't theater anymore. Sammy Davis Jr., the man who had sung for presidents and danced his way out of Harlem's poverty, stood alone in that spotlight with nothing but his wit as armor. The sweat on his brow wasn't from the performance, it was from the sudden recognition that his next words would either save his life or end his career. The audience held their collective breath, champagne glasses suspended halfway to painted lips, knowing they were about to witness something that would be whispered about for decades. But before that suffocating silence in Las Vegas, before the spotlight and the mob boss's chair scraping against polished floors, there was a different stage, a wooden platform in a Harlem vaudeville house where a 3-year-old boy named Sammy first learned that survival meant reading faces like sheet music. His father, Sammy Davis Sr., would crouch beside him in the wings, tobacco on his breath, whispering the most important lesson a black performer could learn in 1928. Know your audience before they know themselves, watch for the dangerous eyes in the back row, and never let them see you sweat. The child learned to tap dance before he could properly walk, his small feet creating rhythms that could shift a hostile crowd's mood in seconds. He watched his father transform rage into applause with nothing but a smile and perfectly timed joke. Watched him bow deeper for the men whose hands rested too casually in their coat pockets. Every performance was a negotiation with danger, every encore a small victory against a world that wanted to keep them small. Young Sammy absorbed it all, the way his father's eyes scanned exits while taking bows, how his voice could shift from velvet to gravel depending on who sat in the front tables. By age 10, Sammy could identify a threat from 50 feet away, could sense the precise moment when entertainment needed to become survival. He learned that talent alone would never be enough, that a black entertainer needed to be 3 times as good and 10 times as careful, reading every room like his life depended on it. Because someday in a casino showroom thick with cigarette smoke and dangerous men, it absolutely would. The mob boss rose like a thundercloud gathering itself, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through Sammy's mid-note like a blade through silk. Every conversation died instantly, every champagne glass frozen halfway to lips, every dealer's hand suspended above their cards in the adjoining casino. Sammy's voice faltered for the first time in 30 years of performing, his fingers gripping the microphone stand as though it were the only solid thing left in a tilting world. The man's face was stone carved into fury, his eyes holding that particular darkness Sammy's father had taught him to recognize in Harlem's back rooms. "You think you're funny, Sammy?" The voice carried across the showroom without effort, each word dropping like a hammer on crystal. "That joke about Italian restaurants, you talking about my family's business." Casino security guards pressed themselves against the walls, suddenly fascinated by their shoes, understanding that intervening meant choosing a side in a game where both choices ended badly. Sammy could feel 400 people holding their breath, could sense careers and reputations hanging on whatever words left his mouth next. His mind raced through every lesson learned, on every dangerous Stage. Every time his father transformed threat into laughter, every narrow escape that had taught him survival's brutal choreography. The spotlight felt hot as judgment, the silence pressing against his chest like a physical weight. He could run, apologize, grovel. Options that would save his body but destroy everything he'd built, every door he'd kicked open for the performers coming behind him. Then something shifted in his stance, that old vaudeville instinct taking over, and Sammy smiled. The smile wasn't submission, but transformation. Sammy's entire body language shifting from prey to performer in the space between heartbeats. He stepped forward into the light, rather than back into shadow, treating the mob boss not as executioner, but as an unexpected scene partner who just fed him the perfect setup. His voice dropped low, intimate, pulling the entire room into conspiracy as he gestured toward the stone-faced man with showman's flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen, finally, someone brave enough to tell me my cooking jokes need work. And believe me, when this man gives culinary criticism, you listen because he knows quality." The audience caught their breath as Sammy moved closer to danger rather than away, his hands painting pictures in the smoky air, building the bit with fearless precision. "I was trying to compliment Italian cuisine, but clearly I need lessons, and, sir, I'm hoping you'll teach me, because any man who commands a room like this clearly knows about proper seasoning." He paused for timing born from vaudeville's unforgiving stages, his eye twinkling with calculated mischief. "And I do mean commands. I've played for presidents who don't get this kind of instant respect." The joke landed exactly where Sammy aimed it, transforming the mob boss from threat into authority, from antagonist into dignitary deserving recognition. Laughter rippled through the room tentatively at first, then building as people realized they'd been granted permission to breathe again. Sammy pressed forward with another line about needing protection from bad restaurant reviews, each joke carefully elevating the dangerous man rather than diminishing him, making him the sophisticated power broker instead of the heavy. The laughter started like distant thunder, rolling from the back tables where lesser players sat safely removed from the storm's center. It grew louder as the mob boss's granite features shifted almost imperceptibly, one corner of his mouth twitching upward like a crack appearing in ancient stone. Sammy held his ground in the spotlight, sweat gleaming on his forehead but his smile never wavering, waiting for the verdict only this man could deliver. The entire Sands showroom hung suspended between violence and celebration, every soul present understanding they were witnessing something that would be whispered about for years. Then the mob boss threw his head back and released a sound that seemed impossible from such a feared throat, genuine laughter that boomed across the velvet room like absolution itself. His massive hands came together in thunderous applause as he settled back into his booth, reaching for his whiskey with the satisfied air of a king who'd just been entertained by the court's finest jester. The room exploded into relieved chaos, applause washing over Sammy like a tidal wave of gratitude and awe. Women dabbed tears from their eyes, while men loosened ties suddenly too tight around necks that had forgotten how to breathe. Sammy bowed deeply toward the booth, hand over heart, the gesture carrying both theatrical flourish and genuine respect for the tightrope he'd just walked. The mob boss raised his glass in salute, nodding once with acknowledgement that passed between men who understood power's delicate choreography. Tables erupted in standing ovation as Sammy spun back to the microphone, his body moving with renewed electricity. The band kicked back in without missing a beat, following their leader, who'd just transformed certain death into his greatest performance. The velvet curtain fell like a guillotine blade that had miraculously stopped inches from his neck, and Sammy stumbled into the wings, where Frank Sinatra waited with knowing eyes and an already lit cigarette. "Kid, you just pulled the same magic trick you did at the Copa 2 years ago," Frank said, his voice carrying that particular mixture of admiration and concern, reserved for watching someone survive impossible odds. He handed Sammy the cigarette, their fingers trembling in tandem like soldiers after battle. The chairman of the board had seen this dance before. Sammy turning razor blades into roses, transforming men who could order deaths with a nod into audiences eating from his palm. Frank leaned against the brick wall backstage, smoke curling around his fedora like ghosts of close calls. Past. Tommy Gambino walked into your set at the Copa, remember? Said you'd been seen with his niece, said he was going to make an example. Sammy closed his eyes, remembering that night's particular flavor of terror, masked by footlights and false confidence. Frank continued, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper that acknowledged the sacred and terrible gift his friend possessed. You turned that whole beef into a bit about how you couldn't tell one beautiful Italian girl from another because you only had one good eye. Made him laugh so hard, he became your goddamn protector. The dressing room mirror reflected a stranger wearing Sammy's face, stage makeup cracking like dried riverbeds. Across skin that suddenly felt paper-thin and ancient. His fingers fumbled with the cigarette lighter, hands that had just commanded an entire showroom, now betraying him with tremors that rattled like dice in a desperate gambler's fist. The laughter still echoed in his skull, but here in this cramped sanctuary of costumes and cold cream, he could finally stop dancing, stop smiling, stop being the magical Negro who transformed hatred into applause. He pressed his palm flat against the vanity to steady himself, watching his reflection fragment into 1,000 possible deaths he'd narrowly avoided. The weight of survival pressed down on his shoulders like invisible chains forged from every room he'd ever had to read, every dangerous face he'd learned to decode before it decoded him into a headline. His father's voice haunted the silence. You ain't just performing, Samuel. You're negotiating for your life every single night. He dragged smoke deep into his lungs, feeling it burn like the truth he could never speak from that spotlight, that his genius wasn't just talent, it was a survival mechanism honed since childhood, a superpower born from necessity. Every joke was a shield, every dance step a dodge, every song a prayer that tonight wouldn't be the night his luck ran cold. The knock came sharp and sudden, 3 precise raps that shattered his fragile solitude like a hammer through stained glass. Sammy's spine straightened instinctively, muscle memory overriding exhaustion as he crushed the cigarette into crystal, already rebuilding the mask even as his reflection pleaded for rest. The door swung open without permission, and there stood the monster himself, the mob boss who'd nearly ended everything an hour. Ego now cradling a bottle of Remy Martin Louis XIII like a peace offering, wrapped in expensive glass. You got balls, Davis, the gravelled voice rumbled, devoid of threat now, almost gentle, as 2 tumblers materialized from his coat pocket like a magician's trick. The cognac poured amber and ancient liquid history flowing between mortal enemies, who'd somehow crossed into something stranger than friendship, mutual recognition. I've watched 1,000 men piss themselves over less than what I did to you tonight, the boss said, settling uninvited into the chair beside Sammy, close enough that cologne mixed with cigarette smoke and unspoken violence. Sammy accepted the glass with steady hands now. The performer's tremor mysteriously vanished, because this scene demanded a different character entirely. Not the jester, not the survivor, but the man who'd earned something rarer than applause. They drank in silence, thick with understanding. 2 masters of dangerous arts toasting the razor's edge, where respect and death dance their eternal waltz. My father taught me everyone's got a button, Sammy finally spoke, voice raw with truth instead of melody. You just got to find it before they find yours. The envelope arrived yellowed with decades, addressed to a struggling comedian named Marcus Webb, who'd bombed 3 sets that week and contemplated quitting comedy forever. Inside, brittle newspaper clippings chronicled a Vegas night when death wore a tuxedo and laughter became armor, accompanied by a handwritten letter from someone identified only as a witness who never forgot. The words trembled with reverence, describing how Sammy Davis Jr. transformed a loaded gun moment into legend, how he'd alchemized terror into performance art, while an entire room held its breath between tragedy and triumph. Marcus read it twice in his cramped apartment, then a third time aloud, tasting each sentence like communion wine, understanding finally that comedy wasn't just about jokes, it was about survival, disguised as entertainment. The final page contained Sammy's philosophy, transcribed from a conversation the witness had overheard backstage. Turn every threat into a performance and every enemy into an audience. Marcus pinned those words above his bathroom mirror where he practiced material, where he rebuilt confidence before each show, where he now saw himself differently, not as a comedian chasing laughs, but as an artist weaponizing vulnerability into strength. He thought about Sammy facing down monsters with nothing but wit and timing, about how dignity demanded more courage than any physical bravery could measure. That philosophy became Marcus's scripture, passed down like ancestral wisdom from one performer to another across the canyon of years. Marcus performed that Friday night with Sammy's words burning in his chest like swallowed starlight, transforming his failures into fuel rather than poison. He opened with the story of bombing, of wanting to quit, of receiving wisdom from a ghost who danced with death and made it applaud. The audience leaned forward, hungry for authenticity, and Marcus understood what Sammy had known, that vulnerability weaponized with confidence becomes invincible, that every stage is simultaneously a battlefield and a sanctuary where courage wears grease paint. The legend spread through comedy clubs and theaters like Benediction, Sammy's name invoked by performers facing hostile crowds and impossible rooms, a patron saint of quick thinking under pressure. His genius wasn't just tap dancing or singing, though he revolutionized both, but rather his supernatural ability to read danger and disarm it with charisma sharp enough to cut tension into confetti. He'd survived Jim Crow and Vegas mobsters, had lost an eye, but never his vision, had faced rejection with such relentless excellence that history had no choice but to surrender and call him untouchable. In green rooms across America, young artists now whisper about that smoky 1963 night when respect was earned at knife point and paid in laughter. They study Sammy's technique like sacred text, understanding that entertainment at its highest form is controlled fire, is danger transformed into light, is survival elevated into art that outlives the artist. His footsteps echo in every comedian who turns pain into punchlines, every performer who walks into rooms that don't want them and leaves those rooms changed. Sammy Davis Jr. didn't just perform for his life that night. He taught generations that dignity under pressure is the ultimate act of rebellion, that genius flourishes most brilliantly when stakes are highest. His legacy isn't preserved in recordings or films alone, but lives in every artist who chooses courage over retreat, who understands that the stage is where we practice being fully human despite forces that demand we be less. Marcus keeps that letter in his jacket pocket now, a talisman against fear, proof that one man's refusal to back down can echo forward through time, turning survival into scripture and danger into dance. What moment in your life required you to turn fear into performance? Subscribe to discover more stories of courage that changed history.